This is my new Filterless Walstad Method aquarium and it's 6 weeks old today. It's exactly the kind of setup I'd recommend for anyone new to the filterless, dirted tank side of the hobby, and it's designed to be as easy and beginner friendly as possible while also looking great. For today's video, I'll walk you through a step-by-step setup of the tank as well as the first few weeks of the tank's journey and cover everything in detail. I'll also be posting monthly updates in this tank's playlist linked in the description, giving you an over-the-shoulder look at how the aquarium develops moving forward. I've also linked to several helpful articles that I've wrote in the description that go into a lot more detail for anyone who's interested in this type of tank. This is everything that I'll be using for the build, and I have added some affiliate links to the description as well as a full plant list going over everything that I'm using, but I'll explain everything in detail as we get through the video. For this setup, I'm using a 25 litre or 6.6 US gallon aquarium, but anything between 20 to 75 litres or 5 to 20 US gallons should work perfectly fine for a beginner new to this side of the hobby. That said, the exact same processes work for far larger tanks, just beginners tend to stick with smaller tanks due to budget and size constraints. I started by adding some affordable window privacy film to the back of the tank to improve aesthetics, but it's optional, but I think it does improve the look of the plants. Next comes the nutrient layer, which is around ½ an inch or just over 1 centimetre of regular garden topsoil. If you're outside of the UK, any organic, chemical-free topsoil or potting soil will work perfectly fine. This layer helps provide some initial nutrients to the plants to help them establish themselves, and it also makes sure they'll grow well, and healthy grown plants are essential to help naturally purify the water. Topsoil also introduces beneficial microorganisms to the tank, some of which help break down organic matter into natural sources of CO2 for plant growth. Some people do prefer a full inch or around 2.5 centimetres of topsoil in the tank, but personally I've never found it necessary. On top of the topsoil, I add 1 inch or around 2.5 centimetres of a capping layer of fine gravel to keep the soil in place and prevent it from clouding the water. This layer can also provide surface area for beneficial bacteria colonies to maintain water parameters, but with the specific plants I've chosen, those bacteria colonies probably won't be needed. It is important to realise that the soil contains both water-soluble and non-soluble nutrients, so in theory the capping layer can help slow the release of some of the water-soluble nutrients in the early stages, but it is difficult to measure the impact. I'm using the regular Petchii Roman gravel, which is very affordable and easy to find if you're in the UK, but any sand or gravel with a grain size of between 1 and 4 millimeters will work perfectly well for the capping layer. So at this point of the build, the substrate consists of roughly ½ an inch of topsoil capped with 1 inch of fine gravel, which is my preferred setup for this style of tank. If you've started to build your tank away from where you'll be displaying it, now is probably a good time to move it to your rack or table while it's still lightweight before we fill it with water. Adding an aquarium light at this stage makes planting a little bit easier because you can actually see what you're doing in the tank. For this build, I'm using the Siora SR616 light, which I've got on several aquariums, and in my opinion, it's the best entry-level light on the market at the time of recording. It's full spectrum, meaning that it has a mix of different coloured LEDs in it to try and hit specific peaks for optimal plant growth. I've grown a wide range of easy category plants with this light, and a few medium category plants too, as well as one advanced level species. I run it at maximum intensity for 6 hours per day using the built-in timer, but you can tweak its settings to meet your needs. Next, I place a small piece of plastic over the substrate to try and absorb the force of the incoming water and prevent the substrate layers from mixing. Then I slowly add just enough water to cover the substrate because this helps release any trapped gas that we've got at this stage of the build while also making planting easier. Now, adding this much water at this stage is optional, but I do highly recommend it, and while the gas pockets aren't really that much of an issue in the long-term side of things, it really does make things a lot easier to do when it comes to getting your plants to stay in the substrate. Moving on, and we get to Hardscape, and this part is also completely optional and you can skip it entirely and just add more plants instead of Hardscape if you prefer. Personally, I do like to add at least some hardscape to my tanks because I think it elevates their appearance and it does help you break up the midground and foreground. For this setup, I've selected 2 small pieces of lava rock, which is very affordable and usually easy to find, as well as a piece of corbo wood. I place some kitchen roll between the rocks and the wood and then use aquarium safe glue to bond them together. If you live in the UK, I recommend the Horizon Aquatics Hardscape and Plant Glue Duo pack because it comes with some included glue tips that perfectly fit the bottle and make the glue application phase very easy. When using the hardscape glue, you may notice a little smoke being generated due to the chemical reaction with the kitchen roll for a couple of seconds, but this is completely normal and is supposed to happen, showing that the bonding process is working. To decorate the hardscape, I picked up some epiphyte plants that get mounted directly to your rocks or driftwood rather than planted in the aquarium soil, and I've went with Anubias Petite and Bucephalandra Bukit Kelam. I started by breaking them down into their individual plantlets and arranging them on the hardscape just to see what I like the look of best. Once I was happy, I started to glue them in place, but if you're using specific aquarium glues like the Horizon Aquatics one or the Mosscapers one, keep in mind that there's 2 different formulas, one for hardscape and one for plants. As I mentioned, the glue tips make this very easy and you can control exactly how much and where the glue is going, making it very easy to get the glue only on the roots of your epiphyte plants and make sure none of it gets on the rhizome. You really do only need a small amount of either the Horizon Aquatics or Mosscapers glue to hold these plants in place too, so there's no need to overdo it. This is what it looked like when everything was mounted in place, and I know the hardscape's nothing overly flashy or anything like that, but it does the job of adding some different colours and textures to the tank and breaking up the background and foreground. Thankfully, the glue not only dries but fully cures very quickly, allowing me to move the hardscape into the tank almost as soon as I was finished, positioning it quite centrally but leaving enough planting space around it for other plants. Here's a top-down view so you can see the space that I've left both in the background and foreground for adding additional plants to the tank. Now it's time to plant the rest of the tank, and you don't have to stick with the plants I've used, but when done right you can combine a mixture of practical plants that will naturally purify the water and keep your shrimp and fish safe, with a bunch of decorative plants that help increase the visual appeal. Since this video is aimed at beginners setting up their very first filterless Walstad Method aquarium, I've specifically chosen plants that are very easy to keep. One tip to keep in mind is that a lot of potted aquarium plants actually come with multiple plants in a single pot. This Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii is an excellent example of this because you can gently pull the clump of plants apart and get a lot of individual plants to save you money. I personally like to start by planting the midground so I can better judge the amount of space I'll have left for the foreground and background plants. For this setup, I added some Echinodorus Tropica to the left and just in front of the hardscape. It's a small hardy sword plant that's perfect for nanotanks, and in my experience it's very easy to keep. On the right hand side of the hardscape, I filled it with as many Cryptocoryne Beckettii Petchii plants as possible, but I did have a few of them left over, so I added them to the front of the hardscape just to get some different leaf textures there too. Here's a top down at this stage showing the midground filled with a mixture of plants and hardscape, leaving the background and foreground open for additional plants. For the foreground, I'm going with Helanthium Tenellum Green from an in vitro cup, and in my opinion it's the easiest low-tech plant to keep for the majority of people. It does take a couple of minutes to separate it down into the individual plantlets if you're getting it from an in vitro cup, but it is worth it because it lets you spread it out in different areas of the tank to save time on it filling out and forming the carpet. This plant rates low light very well, and once it's gone through a potential melt phase and established itself, it carpets out at a decent pace. Once separated, I added individual plantlets roughly every 1 to 2 inches in the foreground just to try and space it all out. I am using planting tweezers for precision, but you can definitely use your fingers with this type of plant too. Don't worry if you're using a smaller nano tank like myself and the initial taller leaves look out of place, because these will usually melt back and then be replaced by new submerged form leaves which are shorter than the immersed out of water grown leaves. Don't worry about the gaps between the plantlets either, because once established it'll send out runners and fill in the foreground of the tank. So with the foreground and midground planted, it's time to move on to the background, and this is the area where I put in the faster or at least moderate growth rate plants to do as much natural purification as possible to keep the water parameters safe and stable. For this tank I'm using a mix of Limnophila Sessiliflora and Rotala Rotundifolia because both are beginner friendly stem plants with different growth rates. Limnophila Sessiliflora has a very fast growth rate, making it excellent for quickly absorbing a lot of the excess nutrients in the tank and keeping everything safe, but the flip side of that is that it usually needs trimming every 2 weeks. Rotala Rotundifolia has a moderate growth rate in my experience and usually needs trimming far less frequently, potentially once every 2 months or so. You can adapt these plants depending on the amount of maintenance you want to do with your tank, so if you have more time to do trimming, you can use the Limnophila Sessiliflora, or if you want to space out your maintenance sessions, you can use the Rotala Rotundifolia and just skip the other plant out of the background. That said, if you are over in the United States, it is on the controlled species list and it generally prefers softer water anyway. Another great option for anyone who lives in a hard water area is Hygrophila polysperma. It also can have a very fast growth rate in moderate to hard water, but unfortunately that's also on the controlled species list for the USA. I've had a lot of people in the United States report that Hygrophila deformis, common name water wisteria, is basically their fast growing plant of choice because most US homes tend to have moderate to hard water, and thankfully that specific plant is not on the controlled species list. But another strategy is just to use a lot of stems of a moderate growth rate plant like Rotala Rotundifolia or pretty much any easy category of Ludwigia, and instead of just adding a few stems, you'll add a lot of them just to make sure they absorb all of the toxins. For this specific tank, I'm adding a Limnophila Sessiliflora to the back centre to soak up as much of the initial surge of water-soluble nutrients out of the soil as possible. Once that's under control, you can reduce the amount of stems in the tank because things start to normalise as the water-soluble nutrient burst dissipates. I then add Rotala Rotundifolia to the back left and right to add some variety in leaf colour and leaf shape because the tips of these stems can develop an orange to yellow hue with this light. You can stick to a single plant species in the background for your natural filtration if you like, but if this is your very first planted tank, I would recommend you go with at least 2 if possible, just because some plants prefer different water parameters and one of them may melt. Here's a top-down view showing everything planted in place, and don't worry about the gaps between the Rotala and Limnophila and some of the other plants. As they're growing and fill out, they will bush out and fill those gaps. Once the planting is done, I place the plastic sheet back in the tank to soften the water flow out of my siphon and fill the aquarium with water. This is just regular water directly out of my tap. I'm not using RO water or distilled water or anything like that, but my tap water has a pH of 6.4, a GH of 4 and a KH of 3, which is optimal for plants like Limnophila Sessiliflora. But like I said, if you live in a moderate to hard water area, then Hygrophila polysperma or Hygrophila deformis are both great options for that type of water. Tap water will often contain chlorine or chloramines as well as several heavy metals, so I do add an affordable tap water conditioner to neutralise them. But with this method, there is absolutely no need to go with the more expensive tap water conditioners that also detoxify ammonia and nitrite. It's simply not needed with this method. For heating, I'm using a Hygge HG83 nano heater, and its tiny size makes it perfect for this size of nano tank. But, and this is important, in my experience it can start to struggle to maintain consistent temperatures above 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, but with the specific setup I'm using and the fish and shrimp I'll be stocking, this is not an issue. Both plants and the beneficial microorganisms we take advantage of for this type of setup do tend to do better in slightly warmer water. Now, it doesn't have to be tropical temperatures, but keeping your water temperature above 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit is recommended. Depending on your area and your ambient temperature, depending on your climate, you may not need a heater, but here in northeast England it keeps things very safe and easy. I've set this one at 23 degrees Celsius or 74 degrees Fahrenheit just to give a little buffer room for the plants and microorganisms to keep everything active. This temperature prevents the plants going into dormancy, which is kind of hibernation for plants, and it also keeps the microorganisms active to maintain safe and stable water parameters. This is what the tank is looking like at this stage of the build, but it's important to note it's normal for background stem plants to be leaning over at this stage of the build. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. Over the coming days, the plants will start to grow towards the light source in the tank and grow vertically. It's just part of the process. Next up is water flow, and this step is technically optional because your tank will have naturally occurring passive water flow movement from heat convection and the movement of your livestock and things like that, but I do recommend adding a source of active water flow if possible. If this is your very first aquarium ever, personally I do recommend you actually add a small nano heater just to act as a backup, because there's a lot to learn in a very short period of time and it just offers some peace of mind. For a tank of this size, I'd personally recommend the Nicrew Slim hang-on back filter because it really is a great choice and I use it on several of my other aquariums. Ideally, you will replace the included cartridges with some other sort of filter media, ideally 30 ppi foam and some filter floss. But I also understand that going fully filterless is a big draw for this side of the hobby, so an affordable USB water pump is a solid alternative for some active water flow. This circulates the water in your tank so it comes into your live plants more often, allowing them to naturally purify the water more efficiently and keep everything safe. But for a nano tank of this size, I highly recommend you set your USB water pump to the lowest flow setting to avoid overwhelming your fish, plants or even shrimp. If you do get one of these USB water pumps and you add it to your tank and it doesn't move water straight away, turn it upside down because air does get trapped inside, and this helps flush out the air and then turn it the normal way, and it should work without issue. Now you might be wondering why choose a water pump instead of a traditional filter, but there are actually some advantages of not using a microorganism based cycle. This is because in a conventional filter based microorganism cycle, the ammonia is rapidly turned into nitrate, but plants expend energy to convert that nitrate back into ammonium before they can actually utilise it, wasting energy. With a plant-based cycle like the one in this tank, ammonium can be uptaken directly from the water column, preventing the plants from having to waste energy and improving plant growth. On top of that, a plant-based cycle also requires smaller beneficial microorganism colonies that can use up a lot of dissolved oxygen in your tank, resulting in higher dissolved oxygen levels for your fish, shrimp and snails. Moving on to floating plants, and while these are optional, I highly recommend them, especially if you're new to filterless tanks, because they are excellent at naturally purifying water. For this tank, I've gone with Spirodela, which is commonly known as giant duckweed, and I'm using it for the first time, but it's really impressed me. Regular duckweed or salvinia are also excellent options for floating plants for nano tanks of this size. If you've chosen a larger aquarium size, then water lettuce or Amazon frogbit are also excellent options for this type of tank, but they are less practical for smaller nano tanks like this one because their roots hang deep in the water column. The main advantage of floating plants is that they sit on the water's surface and have easy access to atmospheric CO2, supporting a rapid growth rate. This means that they'll absorb a wide range of different potential toxins from your tank's water column to meet the potential growth rate supported by the atmospheric CO2, sucking out a lot of things that are toxic to fish, shrimp and snails. The most common mistake I always see with floating plants, especially with active sources of water flow, is that the water flow is simply too close to the surface, so if you have used a USB water pump, push it to the middle of your tank so it doesn't disturb the floating plant's nutrient uptake. This is what the tank looks like at this stage of the build, and from here it does become a waiting game, letting the water soluble nutrients be released from the topsoil, and we'll deal with that with either plant uptake or water changes. Here's some B-roll footage from some of my other aquariums where I've chosen to integrate houseplants into the system. I haven't done this with the featured tank that I'm building in this video because I'm trying to keep things as simple and beginner friendly as possible, but personally, I do think that using suitable houseplants on the rims of aquariums can be a great option instead of floating plants. If you are going to be integrating houseplants into your own tank, then I do recommend you get them a dedicated grow light because most aquarium lights sit too low on the aquarium to give them any real lighting source. Tradescantia is one of my personal favourites for this because it comes in a wide variety of colours and it has a rapid growth rate, pulling a lot of toxins out of the water as nutrients. I've recently tried some Photonia and so far it does seem to be going well, and these also come in a wide range of colours to help with water purification too. I've also had decent results with Pothos, Monstera and Peace Lily, but there's a lot of plants out there that can work. Like floating plants, houseplants have easy access to atmospheric CO2 which boosts their growth rate. The main advantage houseplants have over floating plants is that they don't cause issues with light penetration for your submerged plants. On the flip side of that though, floating plants can act as a natural lid, reducing the risk of some fish species jumping out of the tank while also slowing water evaporation, reducing the need for water top-ups. So with this setup complete, I want to jump into the first 6 weeks of the tank's life. The day after setup, the first thing I did was sync my Siora SR616 light with the rest of the aquarium lights. To do this, I waited until the other aquarium lights in my fish room started to turn on, then I activated this light, pressed and held the W button for 3 seconds to set it to maximum light intensity, and then I pressed the clock button until the 6-hour timer lit up. This way the light will turn on at the time I set that timer every single day and it'll stay on for 6 hours then turn off and just repeat that cycle without me having to do anything. The light also comes with a ramp up and ramp down period which helps prevent startling the fish. There's also the B button on the controller for maximum intensity blue light, but I don't use it. Some sources suggest that high intensity blue light can increase the risk of certain types of algae grown in the tank, but my plants grow perfectly fine with the regular blue light setting. This is what the tank looked like around 12 hours after setup, and like I mentioned, it's completely normal for stem plants to lean over at this stage. We have to keep in mind that the plants have just gone through a major transition from immersed out of water growth with easy access to CO2 to submerged growth, and they need time to adjust. Since this video is aimed at beginners who might not have a test kit, I'm going to presume you're not checking your own water parameters, but to make a point I did test mine. Around 12 hours after the setup, the total ammonia nitrogen reading for the tank was at around 0.5 ppm, which is completely normal with the Westland topsoil I use, but this is still toxic to fish, shrimp, snails, and some plants. I know that some people add livestock to their Walstad tanks straight away, but personally I do recommend you wait. I used a lot of in vitro plants that come in the little cups that can be more sensitive to ammonia too, so for the first 2 weeks I suggest doing partial water changes every 1 to 3 days. If you're doing a water change daily, 50% should be enough, but if you are waiting for every 2 to 3 days, I would probably lean more towards 80 to 90%. If you do have a test kit, you can just check your ammonia and nitrite levels and get a reading. Personally, I like to keep my ammonia below 0.5 ppm with this type of cycle. Thankfully, this is just temporary once the water-soluble nutrients leaks out of the soil, and once that's under control, this type of tank can become very low maintenance. Again, if you are doing a water change, remember to use your tap water conditioner product to neutralise chlorine, chloramines and heavy metals which can potentially harm plants, but the main focus is protecting the beneficial microorganisms in the tank. At this stage, I also chose to add some red root floaters to the tank. It's not for practical reasons, it's just as a quick test to see if they'll colour up under this lighting, and thankfully they did keep their red colour. By day 2, a slight bacteria bloom had appeared in the tank, making the water a little cloudy, but this really isn't an issue with this type of tank. The toxic ammonia and toxic nitrite were both at undetectable levels on day 2, and I've never had a detectable reading of either since. I think this is due to the water pump constantly moving the water past the Limnophila, Rotala and Spirodela, allowing them to optimally purify the water quickly. Due to the readings from this specific tank, I've actually gone and got some more water pumps to add to some of my other filterless setups just because it adds that extra layer of safety and keeps things stable. By day 3 the bloom had cleared and the ammonium nitrite was still undetectable and the plants were slowly starting to grow vertically towards the light. Even with these good results being confirmed by my test kit with this specific tank, I would still recommend you stick to your regular partial water change schedule for at least 2 weeks if you don't have a test kit. By the 1 week point I still hadn't had any ammonia or nitrite show up on my test kit, but in a passive only flow setup where I'm relying on convection from heat and things like that, I'd probably still be expecting an ammonia reading of 0.5 ppm at this point. The Limnophila Sessiliflora had already reached the surface of the tank, but instead of trimming it, I did choose to let it keep growing out for the first few weeks just to show how much this plant can grow. The Helanthium Tenellum green had already started to send out runners too, showing that it was settling in and starting to develop itself. By week 4 the plant was starting to develop a noticeable green hue, partially due to small amounts of algae starting to grow in the tank, but mainly due to the amount of Spirodela floating on the surface adding a green hue to the light. This was also causing light penetration issues, and the Rotala Rotundifolia in the back right had dropped some of its leaves due to the reduced light penetration, but this can be easily fixed later. But I did decide to remove the excess Spirodela from the surface, and I just use a cheap hair comb to quickly and easily remove it, and then I leave around 25% of the surface covered with the floating plant. By week 5 the Spirodela had already grown back to its previous coverage, so I had to get the hair comb out and remove the excess again. The Helanthium Tenellum green had started to melt in some areas, but this can be normal with this plant due to some of its immersed leaves just needing to fall back and the newer submerged smaller leaves taking over. With it being summer at the time of recording, the evaporation was taking its toll, so I just kept on top of water top-ups too. I also ordered some shrimp online and decided to move some of my Medaka rice fish from one of my other tanks into this one, but before stocking I did want to do some maintenance. I started the first maintenance session by trimming back the Limnophila Sessiliflora. It doesn't matter if you're using Limnophila or one of the Hygrophila varieties or something else, in my experience easy category stem plants are very hardy and easy to trim. I'm not doing anything fancy, I'm just getting in there with my Aquascape and shears, but regular scissors work fine and cutting each of the stems to a height I want. If you have underplanted your tank due to budget reasons, this is a great chance to fill it out in the background, because with stem plants, the healthy trimmings that we are removing can be replanted, and over the course of a few weeks they'll grow roots and start growing a new plant. There is some filamentous algae growing in the tank at this stage, but this really isn't an issue because the shrimp that I'll add soon will eat this if needed. I did use an algae scraper to clear the front glass pane, and if you don't have one, a cloth or some kitchen roll works perfectly well, but the process only takes a couple of minutes to clean. Because the initial burst of nutrients released from the topsoil has now passed, this should be the worst algae growth you see in this type of tank, and things should get easier moving forward. I did decide to do another partial water change in the tank to try and remove as much filamentous algae as possible, but also make it easier to trim some of the plants. Even after trimming the Limnophila back initially, you can see how much plant mass is still in the tank. This is because Limnophila Sessiliflora will happily throw brand new stems from the base of the plant if it's happy with water parameters, but I did decide to remove some of them. The Rotala Rotundifolia also needed some attention because it was dropping low leaves due to light penetration caused by the floating plants, so I decided to uproot it from the tank. This isn't something most people will need to do if you've stayed on top of your plant trimming from the start, but like I said, I intentionally let the plants grow wild just to show how much plant mass this type of tank can generate, and that plant mass is generated by things that would be toxins in the water column, which would otherwise stay there or need to be removed by water changes. I trimmed the Rotala stems to just above the leafless section and then replanted them back in the tank with my tweezers. Once all the Rotala and Limnophila stems had been maintained to the level I wanted, I added the plastic sheet back to protect the substrate and filled it back up with water. Again, don't forget your tap water conditioner, but this is what the tank looked like at this stage. Given how quickly Limnophila Sessiliflora can grow, it'll probably hit the surface of the tank and need trimming again in less than 2 weeks. Then I started to move over my Medaka ricefish from one of my other tanks that I was taking down. Japanese Medaka ricefish are hardy and beginner friendly and come in a variety of colours, and they are becoming easier to find in the West at better prices. Initially I did move 4 over, but I do think that one of them has either passed away and been eaten by the shrimp, or it's jumped out of the tank and I can't find it because I've only been able to count 3 at the same time since. I did feed them a small amount of microgranules to help them settle into their new home and left them alone for a few hours. This is what they were looking like just before the tank lights went off a few hours later, and they were happily exploring their new tank and the water pump wasn't causing any problems with their swimming. The next day my new shrimp order arrived and it was 4 bags in total, but 3 of them were going into a different tank and the last one was for this one. This group was a mix of skittle shrimp, which is basically just different coloured morphs of Neocaridina kept together and have a similar look to the skittle sweets or candy. I acclimated them by temperature matching them in another tank with a similar temperature and slowly adding water from this tank with a pipette to match the mineral content. My water is a lot softer than the breeders, so slow acclimation can help reduce stress and improve survival rates. If you are in the UK, I got these from bestaquariumshrimps.uk and I've always had great shrimp from them. I added red, yellow, orange and blue shrimp and hopefully they'll start breeding soon. Some people say that the offspring of skittle shrimp will revert to their wild coloration, but from what I've seen this takes a long time and is not normal within the first few months, so I did decide to test it myself. Unfortunately, one orange shrimp did die the next day, but in my experience, the orange line of Neocaridina, at least the line we have here in the UK, is weaker than other Neocaridina colours. It's very rare I have problems with my red cherry, bloody Mary or yellow Neocaridina, and I am new to blue and white Neocaridina, but they seem hardy too, it's just the orange line consistently has a high fail rate. My water is at the lower end of their recommended water parameters, so I do think whatever makes them have an orange coloration has made them more sensitive, potentially to GH levels or something like that. On the positive side though, at least one of the shrimp in here had already successfully molted, which is a good sign that they're adapting. Now shrimp really are masters of hide and seek, so don't worry if you add shrimp to your tank and then you can't see any of them. In this clip I can only see a single cherry shrimp out of all of the ones that I added after the tank lights initially came on. But within 2 minutes of adding some food to the tank, they quickly start to come out of their hiding spots to try and grab some food granules, and you'll see that they are still in your tank. So this is what the tank's looking like today, and the Limnophila Sessiliflora is already grown in at a rapid pace and the Rotala has a moderate growth rate, so it does take a little while longer. The 3 remaining Medaka ricefish seem happy and have settled into a routine of eating whichever food I add for them, and then they'll go off and scavenge whatever I added for the shrimp and try and steal that. The shrimp seem to be doing really well too, and I haven't seen any more losses in the tank, which is always a positive sign. So far everything really is going smoothly with this, and it's the absolute dream tank for beginners because there's been so little problems. Overall, everything is going very well, and this tank has been the dream example of what you want if you are looking for your first filterless Walstad Method tank. I really do think that the key success factors for this setup is the combination of steady water flow, plenty of fast-grown plants either submerged like the Limnophila and Rotala, or the floating plants like the Spirodela, and a consistent warm water temperature to optimise plant growth and microorganism growth. I'm not planning to overstock this aquarium, but from my experience with similar tank sizes with similar setups, this tank can easily support a colony of between 80 and 100 Neocaridina shrimp. If I can find more platinum Medaka ricefish, I might add 1 or 2 more to this tank, but I won't be adding anything else. Like I mentioned way back at the start of the tank, if you're interested in this type of aquarium, I do have a bunch of articles that I've written on my website linked in the description. They go into a lot more detail about the different concepts and techniques and things like that can help increase the chances of success for your first try. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, I hope it's been helpful and good luck with your first filterless Walstad Method aquarium.